All right, let's just jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating essay titled Trouble with a Capital K, The Theater of Hope and the Ledger of Reality. It's a thought-provoking piece, and what's great about it is that it tries to make sense of our current political and economic landscape. Not by rehashing the usual partisan talking points, but by looking at the hard structural realities. We're going to break down the author's arguments step by step to really visualize this massive gap between the political theater we see on our screens and what is actually going on in our bank accounts.
The source material actually kicks off with this incredibly striking vignette, and it really grounds the whole analysis. The author describes an unseen, marginalized office cleaner working in Houston's East End the morning after the 2024 election. She's a Mexican immigrant, speaks very little English, and like so many people, she is absolutely essential to keeping the building running, but entirely invisible to the people who own it. When asked about the election results, she just beams and says, "President, strong." Now, the author makes a vital point here. We absolutely shouldn't dismiss this reaction. According to the essay, she is making a completely rational wager on force. After decades of institutional failure, she's basically stopped betting on the traditional system because it's delivered her almost nothing. Instead, she's placing her bet on someone who promises to break it.
And that perfectly sets up Section 1, the K-shaped reality.
So what exactly is the capital K? Well, the author defines it as the massive, growing gap between the theater of politics and our actual economic ledger. The essay points out that for about 30 years after World War II, the American economy was kind of like a rising tide. Wages and productivity went up together, and the middle class expanded. But right around 1973, those two lines started this terminal divergence, forming a K-shape. And the author stresses that this isn't just a neat metaphor, it's a hard economic measurement. One arm of the economy, representing wealth and capital, shoots sharply upward. The other arm, representing wages and the working class, just falls or stagnates. And the scary part? The distance between those two arms is widening with every single decade.
To really put that into perspective, you just have to look at the raw numbers. By 2024, the top 1% of Americans held more wealth than the entire bottom 90% combined. It's wild, right? One arm is literally skyrocketing, while the vast majority of people are stuck navigating this reality of stagnant wages and everyday costs that just keep climbing.
And the source brings the receipts to back this up. Actually, let's look at the inflation-adjusted numbers. Since 1979, the median worker's real wage grew by less than 15%. But over that exact same period, worker productivity soared by more than 60%. Think about that for a second. People are literally working harder and producing way more value than ever before, but it is just not showing up in their paychecks. The ledger is fundamentally broken for the vast majority of the people participating in it.
Bringing this back to Houston for a moment, where our office cleaner works, the author drops this staggering statistic: 35%. That is the chunk of a median household income that gets swallowed up just by median rent in that area. And economists generally define anything over 30% as severe housing stress. So the very people keeping the city running are living squarely in the downward arm of that K-shape. They're struggling just to keep a roof over their heads, all while generating immense wealth for companies that are usually headquartered somewhere else entirely.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Theater of Hope.
So the source asks a really crucial structural question here. If the economic system is visibly failing most of its participants, how on earth does it maintain our consent? Well, the author argues it survives on what they call the theater of hope. This is basically a political marketplace where voters, who have, let's face it, pretty much given up on seeing actual, tangible policy changes over the last 50 years, just perform a vibe check. They look at the screen and try to find a champion who simply makes them feel seen, relatable, and protected. Campaigns spend literal billions manufacturing this authentic-seeming strength and tribal belonging. That's the theater of hope. And they do it because it's so much cheaper and yields way higher returns than dealing with the ledger of reality, which would require actual economic redistribution and wage growth.
Moving right along to Section 3, the Iron Law.
Have you ever wondered why this ledger stays so skewed for decades, completely regardless of who is actually in power? The essay introduces a concept called the Iron Law of Oligarchy. Back in 1911, a sociologist named Robert Michaels observed that any large organization, no matter how purely democratic its founding intentions might be, eventually gets captured by a professional class. And this class inevitably starts prioritizing the institution's survival and their own comfortable jobs within it over actually representing the rank and file. The essay argues that this iron law is a trap that catches everyone. Revolutionary or populist platforms from any side are consistently, quietly softened by a professional class just to protect the existing economic order.
And the author maps out a 50-year timeline,
to show that this is absolutely not a one-party issue. It is a deep structural trap. Look at this progression. In 1971, Republican Richard Nixon ended Bretton Woods, freeing up global capital. Then in 1978, Democrat Jimmy Carter started deregulating airlines and trucking. By 1981, Republican Ronald Reagan broke the Air Traffic Controllers Union. Fast forward to 1999, Democrat Bill Clinton repealed Glass-Steagall, tearing down the firewall between commercial and investment banking. And in 2008, Democrat Barack Obama navigated the massive financial crisis by bailing out the banks, while millions of everyday homeowners lost their properties. Across 5 decades, presidents from both major parties consistently pushed policies that decoupled capital, deregulated industries, and favored Wall Street over workers. It's the iron law in action.
Now for Section 4, Dismantling the Floor.
The essay makes the case that while America was acting out this iron law in slow motion, the actual ideological blueprint for it was being drawn up over in Britain. The author points straight to Margaret Thatcher's UK policies in the 1980s as the framework for this whole global shift. And it wasn't just tough talk, it was a very specific method. In 1984, she broke the National Union of Mine Workers, sending a clear signal that collective worker power wasn't going to constrain capital anymore. The 1980 Right to Buy scheme sold off public housing, which permanently shrank the affordable housing supply and turned homes into financial assets. Then, the 1986 Big Bang opened London up to massive financial deregulation. According to the author, these moves systematically dismantled the collective tools like unions, public housing, and regulated finance that ordinary people used to rely on to push back against elite wealth.
Which leads us to Section 5, the snap of accountability. Okay, so what happens when we just can't ignore this K-shaped divergence anymore? The author writes that populations usually coast along on what they call vague faith. This is that provisional trust we all kind of carry around. The idea that our institutions are just too big and solid to fail, and surely someone responsible is minding the store. We cling to this faith even when we see everyday evidence of institutional rot, like completely unaffordable rent and stagnant paychecks. But history tells us that vague faith has a shelf life. And when it finally breaks, a sudden democratic accounting is forced.
The essay highlights 2 massive historical snaps where this vague faith completely shattered. First, look at the 1945 UK election. Voters actually rejected Winston Churchill, a massively charismatic war hero, for Clement Attlee, who was famously uncharismatic. Why? Because Attlee offered the specific democratic machinery they desperately needed, like building the National Health Service and mass housing. They literally chose the ledger over the theater. Fast forward to the 2026 Hungarian election mentioned in the text. Voters finally broke Viktor Orban's 16-year hold on power, electing Petr Magyar's party specifically to restore independent courts and a free press. In both of these cases, citizens looked right past the theater of strongmen and voted to rebuild democratic machinery and actual accountability.
Finally, we arrive at Section 6, Houston, now.
And this brings us full circle, right back to the office cleaner in Houston. The author lands on a really powerful realization here. While the cleaner's frustration with failed institutions is 100% justified, and her vote is a completely logical reaction to being ignored by the professional political class, the ledger is still not balancing for her. A performance of strength on a screen is not the same thing as strength actually being exercised in her best interest. Ultimately, she doesn't just need a strong man, she needs a functioning society. She needs collective bargaining, working courts, and institutions that haven't been captured by the iron law. She needs the actual boring machinery of accountability. We are literally standing right in the middle of this expanding K-shape, and the warning lights of institutional failure are flashing everywhere. So as this gap just keeps getting wider, the essay leaves us with one final provocative question. Are we going to keep shrugging at the screen, settling for the theater of hope and the daily vibe check? Or will we finally demand a real democratic accounting of reality and force the machinery to tip back in our favor?